All right, we're back. It is COMP 2007, and it's week 8 of the summer 2016 semester, and it's part 1 of our broadcast. Today, we're turning over a leaf, and we're going from web forms to ASP.NET MVC. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Again, this is the 3rd time we're doing this kind of stuff. So for today, I am anyway. And it's always that way. The first half is always a little bit challenging to do. Like I always find that for the first half of the day, even the second section, we do a little bit things a little bit better. And always I have extra time at the end, right? So there's a couple things we're going to do today. We're going to talk about again ASP.NET MVC5, as well as we're going to do the lab in class. I want to kind of do the lab today in class, lab 4. Which is up, it's posted up on Blackboard. It's kind of a simple lab to do, and then it'll give you a chance. If you do it in class, then you won't have any more homework. Like, there won't be homework to do for tomorrow. Otherwise, it's due tomorrow at midnight, right? If you can't do it today in class, or you're not able to attend, okay, for whatever reason. So we're using MVC, this MVC book, Professional ASP.NET MVC5. It was written by a couple people. One of them is John Galloway, and he's been doing a lot of stuff with MVA, right? So who knows about MVA? Microsoft Virtual Academy, anybody? Did you use that at all? A couple times. Well, and Microsoft Virtual Academy, I got to point it out because I think it's a good tool for us to use. So if you go to DreamSpark, if you're one of those guys or girls who likes to go to DreamSpark, on the bottom there's a MVA link down here, Microsoft Virtual Academy. And some certifications that kind of go along with it. If you actually do some course on Microsoft Virtual Academy, I think they count. But let me just go back. So what you do is you get to this link here, and there's several videos. One of them is Introduction to ASP.NET MVC. This link here. So that's John Galloway and this other guy, right? That they do it. I apologize. Anyways. The good thing about this one is, when they're producing this stuff here, it's 8 hours of intro to MVC. It goes into depth about routers, about models, about views, controllers, all kinds of stuff about things like identity for security. It uses they kind of have a good example, and so this is kind of neat. It's a good supplement to what we're doing with the book. So the book that we're using, again, written by one of the guys that does this. I'm not going to run it here on because I'm recording on YouTube. But if you were to go to this, then what you get actually is a really cool recording. There's quite a bit of information here from these guys. I think it's Chris Harrison, I think is his last name. Anyways, these two dudes, they kind of come up with this. And there's a couple of really good videos on this. So one of them is this one, Intro to ASP.NET MVC. And the other one is for Entity Framework. This is another really good one. I highly recommend this one. Again, Chris Harrison's on this one. John Galloway's not on this one, but they talk about Entity Framework, in quite a bit of depth. Like, so, talk about how to connect to it. Some of the methods you use to connect. They talk about the database structure, all kinds of stuff that's really, really cool. And again, between these two videos, there's like, I wouldn't say there's less than 14 hours of recording. I'm talking about like actual. I mean, if you did it double the time, you could probably do it in half the time, like a day of doing to make you sick. Entity Framework and MVC, right? But it's actually really quite good. So I highly recommend, if you get stuck, take a look at some of these videos. This one here, not that I'm not saying that MVC Core or ASP.NET Core, sorry, is not good. It's good, and like it says here, formerly ASP.NET 5. There's a difference between ASP.NET and MVC, and we'll talk about that in a bit. ASP.NET is the underlying system that supports both web forms, actually all three, web forms, web API, and ASP.NET MVC. It's not a separate thing. It's actually like an underlying system, a middleware, if you will, that talks to everything else, right? So until recently, what version of ASP.NET have we been using? 4.5, 4.6 now is what's been out, right? So the new one, ASP.NET 5, has changed to ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core is open source and works cross-platform. So it works on Macs, Linux machines, and Windows. And you don't have to use Visual Studio to do C# anymore with ASP.NET Core. And I was struggling with this when I was talking to the morning class and even the afternoon class, and I said, look, over the break, I was saying to myself, should I do MVC or ASP.NET Core, MVC Core, along with it, right? And the answer is, because MVC 6 is MVC Core now, right? The answer is, I just don't think it's mature enough yet for you guys, right? Not because I don't think it's out there. I think there's a few bugs they're working through. They've got the first release out, and it was just released last week, right? Like seriously, that's how young it is. Penetration-wise, it's got maybe 0.5% of the entire market. People have been using it, like as a preview or whatever. So I don't think it's really. It doesn't make sense. You know what I'm saying? If this was the standard, the de facto standard, and we had a little bit more time, I think it's going to have a good penetration. I think there's some really good things around it, and the really good thing around it is it reminds me a lot of most modern web technologies that we use today. Why? Because Core uses web packagers like Bower. You can use things like Gulp for automation, and it all uses Visual Studio. Or if you want to use Visual Studio Code, or you want to use Xamarin Studio, it all works nicely. It packages everything nicely with those IDEs and editors. That's really cool. I mean, I think you've got lots coming in ASP.NET Core. I just don't think it's there, and I don't think it's fair for me to go and do this. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. So a couple of videos, a couple of resources I want to point out, because we're going to be using John Galloway's MVC Music Store for the stuff that we're going to be doing. Like the previous half of the semester, like before the break, what we did was we used the Contoso University as an example to make web forms. We're going to move away from that and use MVC Music Store as the next little project we're going to build over several weeks. We're going to build up to it, add different things to it, and so on. Today, though, we're going to start off with an intro to MVC when it relates to ASP.NET, and as well as MVC5, we're going to kind of build an initial project and do a bit of the lab. Okay, so that's the plan. So again, this is the book, Brock's Professional ASP.NET MVC5 with John Galloway and friends. Really good book, lots of good detail. It includes lots of stuff for you to do, not a problem. And if you were to use this as a resource, it's a great complement to the stuff you're going to kind of produce for this half of the semester. Remember that we have one assignment that we're going to build out this. One part of the assignment is to build up part of the MVC Music Store. That's one part. That's assignment number 2. And then you're going to get your project shortly after that. So please pick your team members as early as you can, because remember that the final project, you're going to build out an e-commerce site, right? That's the plan. And when you build out the e-commerce site, you're going to make almost like a web catalog with MVC. You're not really going to use any kind of payment gateway or anything like that. That's not the requirement. If you'd like to incorporate that, you can. Sometimes Azure requires you to have a paid account for that kind of thing, just like something like SendGrid. You can use it, but it doesn't. They want you to have a paid account. So for me, the most important thing would be like, okay, I have a cart. I add to cart, and then when I'm done, it says thank you for your order. That's it, right? So you don't know if the actual order is processed or anything else. Put a credit card in, but you can mock all that, and so it looks like it's happening. And then we're going to move forward from there. So that's really the project that's coming up, and we're going to talk more about it as I go through this day, and talk about the stuff about MVC. All right, so we're talking about intro to MVC. Some of you haven't taken COMP2007, which is our advanced web programming. There's some people who haven't done that. People who are maybe not here in this course, in this section C, but actually other people in the course haven't taken it. So I've got to talk a little bit about what MVC is, just because for them it's important. In another iteration of the course, I think, and again, we've talked about it from an administrative perspective, that we probably have this course before the Node course, because then you get a sense of what MVC is, and then go to the Node course and then do more with it, an MVC type framework, right? Again, we're talking about ASP.NET MVC, that flavor. So we're going to do kind of understanding what it is, an overview, how to create MVC applications, a little demo, and then how they're structured. I'm going to go pretty deeply into how they're structured, just so that way you guys can understand how this is. Again, following the book step by step. So again, the model view controller pattern, if you think back, I mean, this goes back to the 1970s, late 70s, when they came out with this pattern, this pattern of, and what we would like to call it a separation of concerns, right? Where you have the model, you know, specifically, it's all about how we connect with the data, right? Controller has the business logic that connects to the model. It's almost like the middleman, if you will, and also renders the view, helps to render the view. And then the view itself, which is just the front end, the stuff that the user sees after he makes his request. So the way it would work is the user would make a request to the server would connect with the controller through routing. The controller would talk to the model if there's any data to render, and the model would speak back to the controller and then transport everything into the view, and the view would render onto the page as a response from the server. Kind of request response. We kind of talked about this in the first half, but I'd like to bring it back because that's the kind of thing that's how it works. If you look at it again, ASP.NET, which was introduced in 2002, I mean, it has these two underlying layers. One of them is Web UI, which is the forms layer, and the other one, .web itself, that namespace, which is the plumbing for everything else, for HTTP and handlers and everything else. Both these two namespaces and libraries, they work both with web forms and with MVC. So ASP.NET is almost like that middleman layer that connects everything else together. At one point, ASP.NET was different for web forms and different for MVC. Not so after MVC 5, and we'll see that in a second. And I talked about this already, the MVC, the model view controller kind of behavior. So the view is all about the user interface. But I wanted you to think about two things. The model and the controller are just classes. And actually, John Galloway says that in his MVA video, right? If you go up to Virtual Academy, watch those videos. He says it all the time, over and over again. They joke about it, but they're just classes, right? So basically, you have a model, and the model itself describes things like, the properties. Let's talk about the student model that we did last time with Contoso University. Student has an ID. It has the last name, the first mid name. It has an enrollment date, and so on, right? That's the student model. But we're talking about two different things here. It's not just the database fields, but actually the properties of a class, right? So the user ID or the student ID is a property of the student model, student class, right? And it's a public property, right? So if you know how to make C# classes, then you know models. And if you know C# classes, you know how to make controllers, because controllers are just classes. And we're going to see that. And that's the great advantage when we use MVC compared to something like web forms. Web forms uses a code behind file, right? But they're specific to each page, which means that we have like pieces of code everywhere. That's what it's like. It's like we have and it reminds me a lot of how we used to do Windows forms. Windows forms the old way. And if you guys did rapid application development, then you would have seen the same kind of pattern. Double click on a button, bam, you get this event handler that pops up on the code behind file equivalent of the Windows form, right? Same idea. In fact, it was made to mirror that. You can build it on Windows, you can build it on the web, right? But the problem with that pattern is that you have a lot of postbacks, like nonstop postbacks every time. You might have layers and layers of postbacks. It becomes really massive. Like we're talking about lots of stuff going on. Every page has tons and tons of code surrounding it, right? And lots of postbacks. Every time you shift or do anything in the page, to even render the page, is tons of postbacks. And yeah, our servers are faster, internet is faster, and everything else, but it still makes for a kind of a weird hybrid type of experience with, even when we modernized it with Font Awesome and Bootstrap on the front end and make it responsive and all this stuff, still, it seems a little clunky when we use web forms. And I'm glad you guys did it. I remember I talked about it this morning, and one of the guys in the morning class was like, so why the hell did we do web forms? Because it sucks. And I'm like, yeah, it does. But we talked about this. Web forms is the hard way, right? MVC, and I was telling this to the afternoon class, I want to sell you MVC. I'm going to make MVC. I want to make you love MVC after today. That's my goal. If I can't make you love MVC, I'm talking about look at it and go, you know what, I probably use that. If you don't think that in your mind after I talk to you today, then I've failed. I've done the wrong job. Or somehow maybe you just don't like Microsoft. I don't know, right? Which is also possible. But you should also see this as an alternative. I'm not telling you it's a bad thing. I think it's got a good system. We have Azure now in the cloud that gives us a good platform to just deploy this kind of stuff. And if one of your customers is looking for a secure solution that's stable, right? That's scalable, if you think about it, right? That's got 5 nines support from Microsoft in terms of availability, right? How can you go wrong with a larger supplier? If I sell something to, for example, I was having another conversation with another student to a lawyer as an example, and I say, look, I'm going to store your data on the server, I'd be pretty confident that it's going to be okay. Well, I mean, as confident as any other place that you can put it on that's enterprise level, right? So because it's Microsoft, and I think, I'm not saying that Microsoft is the best or whatever, but it really ties nicely together with Visual Studio and what we're doing here with MVC. And it's out there. I think one of the things that we have out there, and I gotta point out, is yeah, we don't have a lot of MVC out there right now. I mean, 80% is still web forms. Well, let's put that again. 80% is the web forms, and one day web forms is going to go down. It's going to be deprecated. So someone eventually is going to have to transfer all those web form sites, because Microsoft's going to eventually stop support for it, right? They're going to transfer all that stuff to MVC, right? Maybe it's going to be MVC Core at the time, or whatever, some other iteration or incarnation of the core. But the idea is, if you know MVC pattern, and if you know ASP.NET MVC, at least 5, or in the future it's going to be MVC Core, you're golden, because you can have all this work to do. There's tons of work out there for us, right? So again, I think the way to think about it is, and the only thing I want to mention here about the controller itself and the model, both of them, actually, the entire MVC platform has a convention that we use when we create stuff. When I create an MVC application, and remember, we started doing that with web forms, where I said, let's use an empty web form, right? And I'll tell you, we won't do that with MVC. It doesn't make any sense. MVC has been created by developers for developers, all right? I'll say that like this, because imagine if we get together in a room and say, imagine if I had a web framework that I could just, like, I don't know, I want security, I add security. And every piece of security, the way of security I want is there. I mean, if I want to do OAuth, I just plug it in. If I want to, have some kind of functionality, I plug it in. I don't have to worry about the details necessarily, because you know what, we've developed it. Why do I have to redevelop things over and over again? I just want the stuff as a toolkit that I can kind of roll out, modify, change so that it matches the customer, and it's robust enough that it's going to be, enterprise grade, right? That's what MVC is about. MVC is about creating a scaffold so I don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Okay, fine, with web forms, we could do that too, right? But the web forms scaffold is a little ugly, right? You'll see that the MVC scaffold is beautiful. It's exactly what you need and no more. You can modify it heavily, and you can get working pretty quick, right? And so that's a different approach that we're going to use this time around compared to what we did in the first half of the semester. Okay. And also, like I said, it kind of supports the whole, let's do it hard first, and then do it easy after, right? So again, with MVC5's release in 2013, with Visual Studio 2013 was released at the same time, it's one ASP.NET, so there wasn't a difference between web forms and ASP.NET MVC or API, right? And again, for the MVC core, API is going away, right? So there is no more web API as a separate module, separate template. It's going to be incorporated into MVC core, which is kind of cool. And I'll show you the templates. They're a little different. It incorporates ASP identity. Entity framework is built in. Bootstrap templates are there, so it gives you a responsive front end with a very popular framework. Different kinds of routing we're going to talk about. It supports a beautiful scaffold, like I said before, and also a couple of different kinds of filters. One is I can add in different filters, and when I say filters, think about them as decorators, both on the model, so on the C# code for the model, and decorators for the controller. When I say decorators, I mean it actually modifies the methods, right, by just putting in a bunch of code in square brackets, right? So instead of me doing validation as an example on the front end, like we did in web forms, no. We'll do it on the back end on the model. And then it'll cascade down to the web form. That's a better model, right? Because now it's more scalable, it's more maintainable. And you're going to see that that's one of the things that MVC is really great for. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. So when I create an MVC application, and again, we're going to use this MVC Music Store, and for this day, for week 8, if you look at weekly learning, I've put up the MVC Store files, the assets and everything else up on Blackboard for you, so you don't have to go in here and grab it. I've already got it there, right? And we're not going to use that today specifically, but I've got it there, and this is the, I want you to refer back to today, so lesson 8, to get that stuff when we start building out the application week over week. That's all the assets you're going to need to start off with, right? There's also a bit of a SQL file that's in there. We can run a script and run this thing on the server as well. And I've got to figure out one thing to note is that our SQL server that we use today, right, with DreamSpark, does not support two SQL servers. There's one server itself and one database. That's it. You can't run more with the DreamSpark account. And that's why I've been kind of adding on stuff over and over. We just keep adding more tables and more tables. And that's probably what we'll end up doing. We'll just add more tables onto our database. Again, we have like 50 megs. We don't have a lot of data. Chances are we're going to be okay, right? Like unless you start adding other things like images and stuff like that somehow, I don't know why you do that, but if you wanted to do other crap, then it'll slow us down a little bit. But you should be fine. And worst case scenario, if we do run into a bit of a hiccup, what I will do is open up a couple of databases for you on my own. I'll just kind of put them out there, give you the username and passwords, and you just go away. Like, go do it, right? So don't worry about database access. I'll provide everything you need if we run into a problem. Okay, so we're going to get into this, but instead of reading this, this is really for the MVC Music Store, and I'm going to put it up here, but I want to really hit Visual Studio from the get-go. So let's bring up Visual Studio here and start talking about scaffolding an MVC application. Now, I've recently updated my Visual Studio Enterprise 2015 with update 3. That just came out last week, right? Update 3 officially. They had a previous, like a beta release, which I also had. It was because my Visual Studio broke and I had to fix it. But now this is the official release. And the good thing about this one is it fixes some of the problems that I have. But also what you might see is you might see a difference in terms of some of my templates might be a little different than yours. All right, so don't panic. Especially if you're using the school machine. If you're using the school machine, forget it. Your templates are like way out of date, right? So let's take a look at this. I'm going to create a new project here and do it with me. I'm going to choose, so I got 3 main templates here. This is what I got with Visual Studio 2015 Update 3. There's 3 templates. What they've done is they've broken out core into these 2 templates right here. So I'm not going to choose these 2. If you see these kind of templates, we want the old one, ASP.NET. Web application .NET framework, and you want to choose a .NET framework that's the latest for you. My latest framework that I have is 4.6.1, so please choose that, or something like it, something close to it. I'm going to go with, again, the name is going to be COMP2007, summer 2016, and it's going to be lesson 8C, because this is the one we do together and where I record. I have logged into Azure. You may have to do that. It may ask you to re-enter your credentials. It always does for me, so it might do it for you. So please do that now. Make sure that you have both create directory for solution and create new Git repository checked. If you're using the school machine, you might have an option to say add to source control or something. Please check that option because you don't want to do it later. Also, the other thing is before we continue is we're doing our lab now. So this is the lab portion. I'm going to give you everything you need to get your lab started. So maybe you don't want to call it lesson 8C. Maybe you want to call it lab 4, right? Just to make it easy. So when we're done, you hand it in, right? So, I mean, it's up to you what you want to do, but that's my recommendation. Let's click OK. So in the new ASP.NET template, you're going to see these templates, right? So empty, web forms, MVC. The new ones, if I was to go back, I'm not going to do that right now, also include just these. There's none of these at all. So empty web forms MVC. There's no web API because web API and MVC are the same. There's also these buttons down here. These little checkboxes. Notice that this is grayed out because I've chosen MVC, so it's by default included. But I can also check these other boxes if I want. And what they do is include additional references and folders that would be required if I wanted to add in web forms alongside with MVC. So let's say, for example, I want to do web forms. Instead of using the Razor engine that I'm going to talk about today, the Vue engine, I feel like using ASPX. I could do that. I don't know why I would do that. That's kind of a weird hybrid. But it used to be that way. In old versions of MVC, they didn't have Razor syntax. That was only recently, after MVC 3, I believe. So, we used to use ASP.NET ASPX forms, right? So you would have web forms kind of in there anyway. And Web API, if you wanted to, add we're going to do that later on when we talk about Web API. For now, leave them unchecked. Here's the other thing I want you to do. I want you to click on Add Unit Tests. This is something new we're going to add into this section, this half. What it does is it creates a separate project, another project, alongside your main web project inside the solution. So solution is going to have two projects, your web project and your test project. Test project will not be rendered and will not be sent to Azure. It's going to be just for development purposes. We're going to talk about how to do that later on. Also, before you click OK, please click on Change Authentication. Normally what we do is, and I talked about this earlier to the morning and afternoon classes, I'll tell you right now, I was thinking about, hey, let's just do everything from scratch, right? Do empty forms, we're going to make an empty project and build out MVC. Wow, that was crazy. 8 hours later, I'm not joking, right? I finally had something that was very close to what they give you in like 10 seconds, right? And this is the reason, because, again, it's the scaffold makes sense. Why would I try and reinvent something that already exists that's very good, right? That's one. So are we ever going to go and click no authentication after today? No. We're going to always use authentication because it bundles about 12 different views, right? And including things like reset password and blah, 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 all kinds of stuff that's already done for you, right? And we're going to probably use individual accounts for this. For today, though, because we're making Lab 4, I'm going to ask you to do no authentication. The reason why is because we already have students. We're going to base it on the Contoso University. Lab 4 is based on, hey, let's take Contoso University and then spin it into an MVC application. That's great. But remember, some of you already have authentication for that, Lab 3 and other assignments we've done in the past. And if you were to use the new authentication that comes with MVC, it's not compatible with web forms, which would break your other stuff. And because it's my fault, I haven't marked everything, it would break my marking. Please don't do that. So please choose no authentication, all right, for this one. Press OK. I got to put it out there, right? I mean, when it's my fault, it's my fault. And then press OK. So what this is going to do is going to come out and scaffold your application. Now, when it's a nice word, scaffold, but really what it means is it's going to build the directory structure, the structure for your app, in a nice, very, very organized manner. We're going to talk about it, and it's using really cool conventions for model, view, and controller. All right, let's take a look and see what it looks like. So if I look at my Solution Explorer, when it comes up, by the way, I'll wait till this comes up, but for now, let's talk about this start page. Normally, the start page is, or this information page, this project README is pretty useless. But this is pretty good. If you actually click on some of these things, you get some pretty good help and support. So here's what my folder structure looks like now for my project. It's actually pretty good. And surprise, surprise, you have the conventions, controllers, models, and views. And this is where model, view, and controller stuff goes in. I want to start talking about this project structure from the very top. All right, so bear with me and come along this ride with me, because it's important you see all the piece parts. Because I love scaffolds, but the problem is, and we did this in COMP2007 when we did the express generator, unless you understand the scaffold, it's a piece of crap, right? You look at it and go, what do I do? Wow, there's so much extra stuff that I don't need. I don't need this stuff. How do I fly this plane? Kind of thing. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to help you fly the plane. Okay, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to look at the switches and the knobs, and we're looking at. We're going to say, do this, right? And I'm also going to tell you what not to do to break the application, right? Because sometimes, we get really enthusiastic, and then the application is broken. I broke the application. Please don't do this, right? So this is where we're going to start. We're going to start off and say, app start is a very dangerous folder for you. Don't break this application, right? Here's what we're going to do. Let's look at the app start folder. And the first thing I want to look at is the rootconfig.cs file. So double click on that. The rootconfig.cs file is really, it gives us a pattern for what our root is, all of our roots are going to look like. So in the URL, it's going to have controller first. So an example would be my home controller which comes bundled with my scaffold, it's called home controller. The convention is the controller name is part of the root, so home, right? Without the controller piece, right? Then after that, action. The action is just the method that's inside the controller that really represents the page. So example would be index. This is the home index. Home controller, home would be here, and this would be index. And then furthermore, this would be a optional parameter for an ID. You can pass in a numeric value to represent things like user ID, a customer ID, a detail, order ID, whatever kind of ID you want to make. It's a generic ID that you may want to or not want to use. Okay? The default, if I just don't type anything at all, it'll take me to my home controller and look at the index action. Whenever you think about an action, I want you to always think about a method. So think about my request. My request goes out to the server, I contact the controller, like I said, and then it returns back an action. The action is related to a view. So and it's going to be named the same way. So my home controller, think about it as a subdomain, and inside that subdomain, there's 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or however many views that are associated with that controller, and each view is associated with its own method. All right? So a function or method is associated with each view. So this one here, we won't modify it now, and I recommend you don't touch it. It's not broke. Please don't fix this one. Okay? This is good. Next, the bundle config. This is something we're going to touch today a little bit, but not too much. So what is this for? I want you to think of the bundle config as a collection of objects, right? So I've got my bundle collection, which is just a class that is inheriting from the from a list type or generic collection, right? We call this thing bundles, right? That's what it is. This is pre-generated for you, right? And what I'm doing is I'm adding in, right, things like a script bundle or a style bundle. Okay, why? Why am I using a bundler in my MVC, right? Well, I want you to think of it this way. From a maintainability perspective, right, I don't want to talk about jQuery's version. Okay, so I'm not going to look at jQuery's version and go, I want version 2.2.4, but tomorrow, what if it's version 3? So I got to go through each of my templates, and I got to go change the version of jQuery to 2.2.3 or 3.0 or something else. I can just do it here in the bundler, and every one of my other templates will inherit that version of jQuery. Or if I want to include things like Bootstrap or Font Awesome or whatever, it'll all be part of it. I don't have to sit there and go specifically and hard code it into anywhere. In fact, that's what we don't want to do with MVC. I want to try and avoid hard coding as much as possible. Okay, we'll talk about that. So the bundler, what it does is it says this. Okay, so here's the virtual path that I'm going to create. So bundles jQuery, right? There is no bundles folder, right? But bundles jQuery, I can put that in, that script bundle, and it represents scripts, jQuery, whatever the version number is. And if you notice, this is a stand-in, right, for the version number, and then .js. And the same thing goes with my jQuery val, my jQuery validator, right? So it's going to look through, and it's going to look for the jQuery validator that makes sense. Modernizer. Here's something that's a little different. For my style bundle, this is the style bundle, and there's also the Bootstrap bundle. The Bootstrap bundle bundles both Bootstrap and Respond.js together. So it looks at, this is the virtual path that you put into your layout. We're going to talk about the layout in a second, but it actually includes both. Same thing with this content CSS. Not only does it get my Bootstrap, but also my custom site.css file, right? So it bundles those together as one object inside the bundler. Okay. So do I want to touch this file? No, not right now, because my layout file uses these bundles files, almost like if you think about a web bundler, and if you're like, well, why would we use a web bundler? No one else uses it. Actually, they do. They truly do nowadays with Webpack, as an example. If you're a Node.js person, I'm using MeanStack. Webpack is a great example of the exact same thing that's happening right now on the Node stack or the MeanStack. Okay, so they bundle all JavaScript libraries. So you only have one JavaScript library call, and it kind of includes everything else, right? All bundled together and minified. By the way, you don't have to do any. You don't have to worry about minification here. Minification happens automatically on as soon as you compile. It's really good. Again, so really good features to speed up your experience and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we'll talk about this a little bit more. So if I go back to my Solution Explorer, there's one more. I mean, it's a non-touch, but for now, we're going to get into there later on. Filter config. Remember I talked about these, the idea of decorators. We can create our own decorators, our own filters, if you will, to impact things like the model and the controller. But for now, this is just a stand-in. So leave it alone. It's the same kind of idea for us to register global filters, and we can use these global filters in our models and our controllers. So for now, leave it alone. So definitely don't touch, for a bit, don't touch the App Start folder at all. Leave it alone. The other one I don't want you to touch too much is a couple more. The global ASAX file. That would be really bad too. Why? Because it ties what we just talked about together. The filter config, you know, upon application start, it enables or registers routes, filters, bundles, and the area of registration. You don't want to touch this one too. This would break your application. So please don't do that. This is a required file, the global ASAX.cs file. We might mess with that later on though. The other one is your web config. Remember we talked about web config last time. Web config is still part of our folder for now, our project. In later versions, web config disappears. So, so MVC core, normal web config, right? And in MVC core, also what you have is something neat. You have project.json file, similar to the package.json file that I'm used to when I use Node applications, right? Which is kind of cool. Like I like the direction Microsoft's going with MVC core, right? It's just not mature enough for us to play with yet. All right. But if you really want to do it, if you want to learn it or whatever, it's out there. You could, if your team feels adventurous enough, when you get together to to tackle MVC core, go ahead. If you want to do that, I think it might be a good challenge for you. But I don't recommend it if you're. I mean, example, if you have 4 people that are using a Mac, right, and you don't want to use a Windows machine, MVC core might be fun to put together, right? But if you've got a mixed bag of Mac and Windows users or whatever, and Linux, I don't recommend it. There's a little bug. It's a little buggy here and there, and it takes a little bit of effort. It might be more trouble than it's worth at this stage. Although there's tons of videos coming out in support. I can't say enough about it. I'm excited actually about it. It's just not ready. Okay, so that's really it. The stuff you don't touch in a nutshell. Here's something that comes with the bundle: the favicon file, right? Favicon ICO. It's part of the root and knows where to get it. And if you notice, it has different sizes that are automatically generated for you. I highly recommend you replace this favicon with your own when you do your own project. Okay, so that's one. Let's talk about the stuff that we know and love already. One of them is content. Remember, I've been secretly putting together things like content and scripts into your stuff since COMP2007, right? You've been seeing content scripts, and assets too. And why? Because Microsoft uses the same folder structure. So I want it to be familiar to you. So when you see it, you're like, oh yeah, I've seen content and scripts before. Not because you need to, label your projects that way in real life. In real life, maybe you want to call your non-Microsoft project something else, like CSS or whatever, or JS. But I find that content and scripts is descriptive enough, and it makes sense from a structure. And I've been using it all the time now, not because of anything else. I guess it's just become a habit for me to structure it that way. And it makes sense when you look at it, it's contextual. You're like, okay, I know what that is, right? So that's stuff we know and love. One thing we want to do before we progress anymore is I want to shut some of these down first, just to give us some more room. And what I want to do is I want to update my NuGet packages, because remember, this is a template. So template's been created before some of the updates to the NuGet package. So let's right-click on our solution, and I want to go to, one day when it comes up, manage NuGet packages for solution. And notice that there's a bunch of updates, right? I want to select all, but one thing I don't want to do is update jQuery. So uncheck jQuery, please. Why? Because jQuery is recently updated to 3, and it's incompatible with Bootstrap. It'll break your Bootstrap. So please uncheck jQuery and click Update. This will go out, grab the latest versions of the libraries, update them, and I think it's a good practice to do when you're starting off a new project. However, I have to say that it's a really bad practice when you to go out, try and update an old project, because it might break it. I like what they say up on the MVA videos. It's like, what do they say? They called it a resume generating event, right? Because it might break you, right? If you try and break someone else's code or whatever, and you're working somewhere, it might be bad. I used to know it as a career limiting move, a CLM, right? You do something like that, you know, you might break a site, and it could be something that's really, really important. So please don't do that. If you're working with an existing site, leave the packages as is. Work with what you've got, okay? You might be tempted to, right? But it might break something down the road. Example would be, hey guys, how come jQuery needs an update? Bing, I'm going to update jQuery, and bam, nothing works anymore. Now you don't have anything on the front end. That could be just like one simple thing. I mean, you could always revert, but imagine if users are using this thing and now you're down, right? That would be bad. So I want to update jQuery, but I don't want to choose 3.0.1. I want to choose 2.2.4, which is the version that's compatible with version 3.3.6 of Bootstrap for now. I know Bootstrap's on its way to getting finished. It should be almost done. Bootstrap 4, it's just around the corner, probably another couple months or so before it comes out of alpha. Okay, so jQuery's been updated, and it's asking me to restart my system. I'm going to restart now. But before I restart, what I want to do is I want to go to Browse, and I'm going to go to Font-Awesome and load that in too, because I want to kind of simulate what we have from before. There's going to be some challenges when using Font-Awesome, and we kind of handled them earlier today. Again, I have to give credits to John because he's always helping me out. John's like, no, it doesn't work, right? So kudos to John. Let's press OK, and we'll load Font-Awesome and just add a couple more things onto the. And I'm using Font-Awesome 4.6.3, and I'm choosing the first one that I found. And I'm going to restart now. Again, it's going to restart Visual Studio back to where I left it off. But last time when I did this, it took me back to an application I was running with already, and there was the wrong one. Let's see what this one is. This is 8C. That's good. All right, so here we're back with a lesson 8C, and we've updated our NuGet packages. We're now ready to do what I want to do for Lab 4. Lab 4, I want you to take Contoso University's SQL database, and I want you to use that database to produce the models that we're going to use today. Okay, now today's all about controllers, but it's kind of the chicken and the egg thing. You know, they talk about that in the book too, which is like, well, I can't really talk about controllers without having had a model, and I can't talk about, like, you know, a controller by itself without having some kind of views. So you kind of talk about the whole system, at least as an intro, and then go back and really specialize and talk about controllers and models and views. So remember, this week's all about controllers. We're going to talk about them as in depth as we can. Next week we're going to hit views. Week after we're going to hit models, and I'm going to try and incorporate in that time frame. For views, I'm also going to talk about in depth about the Razor, view engine, as well as different kinds of helpers that we can use to generate different things. That's next week. The following week with models, we're going to talk about validation as we get into validation. And then when we hit security, which is the following week, I'm going to probably put in, so not for a few weeks, I'm going to start using unit tests, right? So how do we do unit tests? And this is all stuff that's in the book, but I'm just going to kind of pack it into those weeks so we can have some really good discussions and some challenges for you guys, right? Okay, so let's add the models that we want to add in from our database. So I want to right-click on models. Remember, I'm making a connection to the database. I'm going to go add. I'm going to go to new item. And just like we did before, I want to hit data. Under Visual C#, we're going to hit data. We're going to click on ADO.NET Entity Data Model, right? And down here where it says model, we're going to try and use the Contoso data model again, Contoso model. Right? So Contoso University, we're going to take that Contoso University application we're building and change it into an MVC application for this Lab 4, okay? And you're like, hold on a second. It's a lab, and we're doing this whole thing. We took us, like, you know, how many weeks to do the other one? Yeah, we'll do this in 10 minutes. All right. So here's our EF Designer from database. That's what we normally use. No. EF Designer from database. We have that, the model map that we get from the database. That's being deprecated. So in the new version of ASP.NET Core, it's gone. What we want to use is code first from database. Code first from database relaxes the rules around the model, how it connects to the controller, and allows us to modify the controller without fear. Like, you know, when you download that model, it says, hey, this is generated code. Don't touch it because, you know, it might mess up. Nothing to mess up here, all right? So let's choose code first from database. If you don't have this option and you're using the school computer, choose the first one anyway, okay? The first one would be at least you're going to get the the model from the database, designer from database. So people who are using the school computer, please use the first option. Okay. If you're using the version, I'm using Visual Studio 2015 with update 3. If you're there, then use the last option here, code first from database, and click next. All right, we're going to generate a new connection. Again, we don't have the connection string, so let's do that. So we'll say new connection. You're going to use your own connection. I'm going to use mine. I'm going to say COMP2007 database.windows.net, and I'm going to choose the proper authentication. Okay. And then save my password. Now, when I've come to this point, and if I can do one of these, and I can see my database, I'm good. I've got a connection. So I'll wait till you guys catch up a little bit. Again, we're doing kind of something similar. You've seen this before, right? This is transferable skills we learned in the first half of semester, right? The transfer to MVC from web forms, right? So if you're migrating, this is one way to do it. Create a new project, basing it off your database. And this is actually more realistic because the database exists. We've been using that database before. We don't want to kill it, right? And I want to keep the data. Okay, let's press OK. When I press OK, it's going to generate a new connection, and it's going to say, do you want to include sensitive information? Sure, we'll include it. How do I want to save my connection? I definitely don't want to call it Contoso model. I'm going to call it Contoso connection. There we go. And then I'm going to click next. All right, I'm accessing my tables, and I'm using the DBO model for that. Notice that I have a bunch of other tables because I also created user login, logout for Contoso University. I'm not going to choose these. I'm just going to choose my courses, my departments, my enrollments, and my students tables. All right. I'm also going to make sure that I have pluralized or singularized generated object names checked, like we had before. All right. When I'm here, I'm going to click Finish. What it's going to do is it's going to go out and grab the same information we did before, install any other pieces to the entity framework it needs, right? And then drop everything into models. Now take a look what I'm getting. Now, the only way you're going to get this again is if you have data in that database, right? You actually have your database created like the way we did it last time with your school, your Contoso University database. And now let's take a look at what I've got here. If you look here, under models folder, I have several. I have several models. Now, for the most part, I did a pretty good job, right? I have my Contoso model, which is of type DB context. This is what we did last time, right? With the connection string right there, Contoso connection, and which links back to your web.config file, right? This is what this is right here. I also have some DB sets that represent connections to different tables in the database. Courses, departments, enrollments, and students. Corresponding models. But here's a problem. It's just course without an E. Now, last time we were able to go into the model diagram and change the course from course without an E to course with an E. In this case, all I want you to do is go here to the actual file where it says course without an E over here, right-click, and rename this one to course with an E, the proper way of writing course, and then press enter. It's going to ask you, hey, do you want to modify everything that's related to this file? Absolutely. Press yes. And if you notice, it's going to kind of go through and replace everything that says course without an E. All right, that's done. That's the only change I want you to make right now with your Contoso model. Contoso model. Save. And this is just the DB context. This is really important because we're going to use the DB context over and over again to access the database, right? So save this one, and then close this one off. Okay, so now I have a bunch of different models, right? Now, again, this is not a model day. This is a controller day. But we need to look at the model a little bit. Let's take a look at the student model for a second. Well, here's something that's interesting, right? My student model, it looks like I said, a class. I've got the name of the class. By the way, it's a partial class. Be aware. That means there's another part of it being, created somewhere else, right? It's not a full class. It means that there's part of the definition for the class is here, and part of the definition for the class is somewhere else. We can do that with C#. right? And actually, we do that with with Windows forms as well. If you actually do Windows forms, we create partial classes for our forms that are inheriting the form class, right? Here, in our partial student class, right, we're not inheriting anything, right? But we are relating to the DB context that we decided on. So here's our properties, right? We have, first of all, we have a constructor. Here's a constructor for the model. And the constructor for the model says, hey, enrollments, which by the way looks like a foreign key right here. Enrollments is, I'm going to make it a hash set of the enrollment model. That's what it is, right? So for now, that's what this does. And it automatically was generated this way. Again, kind of keeping the relationship of the foreign key intact. All right, here's student ID. And again, this is just property, so getter, setter. Oh, well, what the hell is this? This is a decorator. This is a filter. This is the stuff I was talking about before, right? What this does, if you were going to make the code first example without getting the database like we just did, what this says is, required says, I want the field in the database to be non-null. All right, so it cannot be null, right? That's what required means. And string length tells me how big the varchar is going to be, varchar 50 as an example. It's not nvarchar, it's varchar 50, right? It should be. This is the name of my field, last name, okay? And the same thing goes with first middle name. Notice here that I also specify a type name for my column, which is a type of date for enrollment date. All this stuff is generated by pulling down the model from the database in a code-first approach. We didn't get this last time when we used that other funky model. We just got the property names because all the other stuff was being handled by web forms. Here, we're going to put all our validation right in here when we do our model. Won't do it today, but we're gonna get to that. All right, so that's what our model looks like. It's a class, right? Okay, let me save that and kind of move on. Here's a problem. What if, just putting it out there, what if I have to change my model, right? If I change my model, and let's say, for example, I take away the required, what am I really doing? I'm now out of sync with my database. My database says it's not nullable, but my model says it is nullable. I'm going to have a conflict. This will break your application if you run it that way. So there's ways of fixing it, and the way to fix it is something called code-first migration. So we're going to get to that. Can't do it now. We're going to do it on model day, so a couple weeks from now. We're going to talk about the model and how to migrate from one version of our model to another, right? Now, there's a problem with this. Some code-first migrations require us to kill the original database. Would we really want to do that in real life? No. And so we have to really limit what we're doing there. We have to really be careful as if I'm adding another field, I got to make sure that it doesn't kill our database, especially when it's required. So imagine I've got a bunch of fields that are required and I got some fields that are not. Then I add another required field. Okay, but I already have data there. So if I add a required field, that means I'm missing a bunch of some data that's required in already existing records, right? That would break our database. So we either have to regenerate that data, or somehow is going to have to go in there and put some kind of stubs in the data, right? In those fields, the new field I'm generating, so that way I don't kill all the data that's in. That's a big job. But you can do that, luckily, with code-first migration. So you actually create a migration file, and then from there it connects to the database and does everything it needs to be done. Not easy to do, and it's one of the most complicated parts of code-first approach, but we can do it. For today, though, we don't have to care about that. We're not changing the database. All we're going to do is read the database and use the database. Okay? All right. So we've done that piece, and we've got our models in place. And if you notice, this is what our models would look like. All right, but we only have one controller, and the one controller we have right now is the home controller. All right? Let's take a look at this home controller and see what we got. Right? So if I double-click on the home controller, remember what I talked about, convention first. Convention makes it so that the home controller, it's called home controller because it's the home subdomain of my site. So when I remember the routing, home, so take the controller part out. Every time I create a controller, there's always going to be the controller keyword inside the name of the controller that I create. Home controller, account controller, students controller, department's controller. You're going to have controller, controller, controller everywhere, right? But also at the same time, the other convention is whatever the method name is, this is the action result, right, is going to be the name of your pages. So home index. This is what the index page would look like. And so what it would look like is something like this. So you would go to /home, right, /index. That's how you get to this particular page. That's what it looks like. And it's using, of course, right, get methodology. So we're using a get, right, which is home index. It's not a post, right? So I'm making a request, and then I'm getting back home index, the view that I'm getting back from my index file. Also, not only that, but what if it's just nothing? Right? Because remember, our default view is the home index. When we looked at that route config file, routeconfig.cs, inside of that forbidden folder, don't touch the folder, right? That one. It tells us that if you go to the default route is, nothing. If you put nothing in there, it'll still go here, right? All right, same thing with the action result about. The about page would look very similar. It would say, so here's my get request for this one, right? It would be home and then about, right? And same thing for my contact. I'm just showing you this so you can see the URL. Well, not GER, it's got to get. Of course, get wouldn't be there. It's just I'm just putting it there so you can see what it looks like. So here's my get request for home contact. So let's try this out. Let's build this application, and I'm going to kind of save everything first, and let's build this thing up. So I'm just going to run this thing. It's going to build, right, for the first time. I'm doing it in a little bit a different order than I did this morning because it saves me a build later on. Okay, and when I run this thing, you're going to notice a couple things, right? One is I've got my there's no route here. If I click on the link home, right, there's still no route up here. But if I type in home, right, it still takes me there. And if I type in home index, it still takes me there. If I type in home about, right, it takes me to the about page. And if I type in home contact, it takes me there too. Here's something. What if I wanted to go to make this contact? Could I do that? No, because that's not the route. It has to be controller first, and then the name of your method or your action. Okay, so that's the way we do things. One of the things I talk, and I'm talking about a little bit out of order like I did earlier, is when we create our controllers from now on, and again, this second half of the semester is a little bit more, it's going to be there's going to be some really good useful information. But one of the things we haven't talked about too much is security. And I talked about this morning, and I'm kind of repeat myself now. I think it's really important that we use SSL as much as possible nowadays, right? So every site you build from now on should have SSL. SSL in every part of the site, right? How do we test that locally with our tools? Well, Microsoft luckily has made it easy for us to do that. So let's make SSL enabled here. So first of all, I'm going to pin this up. I'm also going to pin up the properties, right? And if I look down here, notice that if I click on the project, in the properties pane, the context menu says SSL enabled is false. Let's make SSL enabled true. What it's going to do is it's going to produce an additional URL, right? Here's the HTTPS URL that you're going to use for SSL testing. Now, when you first do this and you run it, it's going to build the application and ask you to create a certificate, a self-signed certificate. It might ask you to do that, right? Or it might say it's unsafe. Do you want to go forward? Do you want to accept this and add this into your safe list? It might say that too. Check it out. Let's try and run this thing. So I'm going to run this thing again. Run with debugging. And I'm going to put in my SSL. You need to run with debugging for this one. But I'm going to grab my SSL certificate, right? Let's go in here. Here's my SSL certificate. I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to go back up here. And instead of localhost 18644, I'm going to pop in my SSL certificate. And now if you notice, it's a different port. But port 443 actually, which is the secure, the exact port we need, but just port 4373. If you notice that I get this green little thing. You may not get this green thing because I made a self-signed certificate for a Mac or whatever. It allowed me to do a self-signed certificate to create, something that works okay. Are you guys good? So we're going to be doing that, you know, like I said, a lot. We're going to be using SSL. And you can test it both ways. You can test it here locally and up on Azure, right? Azure, the great thing is, if you take any site that you have today, any site, and you put HTTPS in front of it, it'll work. Now, if you're going to actually point a domain, a custom domain to your site, that's different. You have to get an SSL certificate for your domain that's tied to your domain. And then when you go to connect to Azure, then you need an actual SSL certificate. And there's lots of free options out there, all right? So for SSL certificates that we'll explore. Again, this is not a security course, but I think we have to be a little bit security minded. And when we do anything with e-commerce, I think it's important for us to think security. Think about SSL. SSL does not stop. It's not just about encryption, right? What it does is think about it as another form of protection, right, when it comes to any messages that we send across the site. And it's important for us to be security minded like this. One person said earlier today, well, you know, SSL is bad for SEO, right? So that search engine optimization, SSL, not so good. Maybe for now, but I know Google has stated very clearly that they're going to start ranking sites that do not have an SSL certificate much lower, right? So it behooves you to start getting SSL certificates for all your customers, and sometimes they can be costly depending on what you want to accomplish with them. But again, there's some really cool free certificates that work just as well. All right, so SSL. Okay, so let's stop running this for a second. So we've got a couple of things going on right now. We've done our model, right? We're a little bit ahead. We've done our model, and again, for the lab, what I asked you guys to do was, hey, go take your Contoso University thing and generate your views, generate everything. Let's do the first one together. We'll take a short break. I'll let you work on it a little bit, and then we'll come back for another recording where I do some other stuff with you. All right? Let's just stop this. Over here. Let's go down here. All right, so I'm going to unpin this one. And what I want to do is I want to create, right now we only have a home controller. And notice another convention. Inside the views folder, I have a home controller. I got to talk about this a little bit. Okay, now this is not about views. Today is not about views, not about models. But again, chicken the egg. I got to come talk about a little bit of both because you need to kind of get a sense of how the whole thing works. That's what I want you to do, right? So inside my views, I have the home subfolder. The home subfolder is where all the other pages live, about, contact, and index. This is where they all live, right? But you know, the key is, and if you think about this, how is it that I'm getting that page? I mean, if I look at my index page, the index page is a partial, okay? It's a partial view. It's not the entire view. I get the Jumbotron. There's the Jumbotron. Oh man, what's this? Right? What's it? This is Razor syntax. This is the new view engine we talked about. The new view engine is called Razor. And the beautiful thing about it is it's just C#. Once I put at, open curly brace, close curly brace, anything in here, that's C#. Right? And that's why it's better in some ways and easier to handle than something like, you know, what we did before with web forms. Web forms, I mean, you could probably do the same thing with web forms, but it wasn't as sleek. Notice that everything else here on this index page is just simple HTML, right? It's just HTML styled, just to give us a landing page for our site. Okay, going back to that, we have this funny thing called ViewBag. What the hell is ViewBag? That's pretty ugly looking, right? Well, let's go back to our controller. Again, today's about controllers, right? So if I go back to my home controller, notice that I have ViewBag stuff everywhere. Well, what is a ViewBag? Right? We're going to talk more about view bags when we do views, right? But the view bag, think about it as a dynamic object that I can add properties to just by declaring them. Okay, just like we used to do with, you know, JavaScript. I have an object in JavaScript. How do I add properties to it? I just declare them, right? It's dynamic and flexible that way. Same thing with view bag, and there's other ones too, right? So view bag, I go viewbag.message. And when I go viewbag.message, there is no viewbag.message originally. I'm creating my message right now, right? There is no viewbag.title. There is no viewbag.tom. But if I make viewbag.tom equal to some value, now there is, right? This is good and this is bad because there's no viewbag dot whatever is very loosely typed, right? And we're going to see later on when we talk about views how viewbag fails us in some ways. And we want to really use is strongly typed properties that are part of my controller that I can access on the actual pages, right? But for now, viewbag, think about it as a container object that I can add anything to if I want to, just by saying viewbag dot. Just like I did with my session variable last half of the semester, where I say session dot whatever, and then add this to the session variable. By declaring it, we're using it, we're creating it. All right, so that's what viewbag is. And if you notice, each one of them has that. Well, here's another thing is, if I declare a public variable that's part of my controller, right, any other method in my controller can use my variable, just like a class, right? Which means I can take this information, because it's public, and I can use it in any one of my views that are associated with my controller. So I can pass data from one object, one page to the other on the back end, right? I can do that very, very simply. Okay. And I can also pass it in as a parameter when I kind of form out the view. Okay. We'll talk about this later on. But let's go back to this index.cshtml page. So whenever we see at anything, it's just C#, right? So in here, I'm saying viewbag.title. If I hover over it, you can see that it's a dynamic object, right? And I'm adding in a title, and the title is homepage. Okay, how am I using this title? Where is it being used? I'm making it, but it's nowhere else. I don't have it anywhere else here. Well, where I have it actually is in some other view. Let me show you it. Right, so here's my solution. So I got my home folder that has all my views related to my home controller, and that's the convention. So whenever I have a controller, I have another folder inside the views folder that is the same first part of the controller. So if I called it home controller, I've got a home folder inside my views. That's the convention, right? And if it was an accounts folder, accounts controller, it would be accounts folder inside my views, right? I also have another one called shared. I have shared, and I also have another CSHTML file. Why is it called CSHTML? Come on, Cindy, why CSHTML? Why is it called that? Come on. Because it's C# HTML. That's why it's CSHTML. That's where it came from, CSHTML. So if you notice, if the rule is, if I don't have a default layout for my view, it defaults to something called view start. Well, in this particular case, viewstart.cshtml defaults to a default layout that's inside my shared folder, and it's called _layout.cshtml. That is the convention. Whenever we do a layout, we use the underscore. It's almost like a private view. Okay, that's what I like to see it as. Again, we use the at, Razor syntax. We say we're assigning layout, right? The property layout, the layout property to this path. And someone said earlier, well, where is this layout? Where is layout being contained? I don't understand where layout is. Well, the great thing to do is if I kind of double click it and I right click and I go to peak definition, right? It's going to take us to the actual where layout is described, right? You can do that for anything in C#, right? And if I scroll up a little bit, you can see that it's part of the start page class, right? Which is derived from something called web page rendering base. So web page rendering base is the superclass that renders the start page, right? And the start page includes something called layout. It also includes page, and there's a bunch of other properties that are included that you can override, okay? As you go through here. So this is kind of a neat thing. You can look at any class this way by right-clicking and saying peak definition. All right. So everything, all the details about that class are right in here. Okay, so we know that the layout is part of the page, right? So the page says, okay, my layout is over here. That's what it means. Okay. So that means that if I go to my layout page, right? Here's my layout in my shared folder. I have this _layout CSHTML. This is what I was looking for. Oh man, this is my layout. This is the site master equivalent from web forms perspective, right? And this is what I want you to modify for this lab. This lab, you need to modify this page so it has your nav bar and all that kind of stuff that somewhat similar to what it looked like for your Contoso University thing. Okay. Also notice that I have my @styles.render. Again, Razor syntax. Every time I use the @ sign, styles.render is using the bundler that I talked about before in the bundle config, and it's saying, hey, take all the stuff that's bundled in when I go to this path, content CSS. Remember, content CSS includes Bootstrap and also includes my site.css, right? So when I have this line in place on line 7, this is where Bootstrap and my site CSS gets injected. Okay, and the same thing goes with my modernizer for my scripts. This is styles render. This is scripts render. So it's gonna pop in or inject, from the bundle those scripts that we've added into the bundle, into that collection. Okay. And now we have some other things we have to look at. We have something called an HTML helper. What the helper does is it creates the anchor tag that we want, right, for the links. Now you might say, oh, I don't understand. Why would I not just put a regular anchor tag in there, Tom? Why am I using these HTML helpers? Do I have to use the syntax? The answer is you don't have to use syntax, but, and this is the real reason why we do it. Remember why I said, MVC 5 is made from developers for developers, right? Because from a maintainability perspective, right, what if my link changes? My link doesn't just change for this page, but for every other bloody page, right? And if I hard code it in here, I've got to go through this anywhere that I've mentioned that link and hard code it out. Whereas if I mention it as an action link, right? And the action link, the way it works is this. This piece represents the text that's part of the anchor tag, the first part. This piece represents the method or the action index. This piece represents the controller that I'm accessing, right? So remember, in my controller, I can control where my stuff actually points to. I don't have to make it go to my index page. Even though it's the index method, I can make it point somewhere else. And I can do that, and it's more maintainable, as an example, and scalable, as opposed to me doing it hard-coded. And that's why we use these action links. So the idea from Microsoft's perspective, right, its philosophy is hard code as little as possible, right? Also, if I want to add some classes, notice that I have a couple of objects here, anonymous objects. One of them is this area, and I can specify an area or not. Here, I'm not specifying an area. And I can also do new anonymous object of a class, and I could add in my default class values. So when it renders the HTML, it's going to use navbar brand, right, to generate my navbar. Okay, so that's how you do it. Here's an action link too. So there's a bunch of action links. They're in the list items, and they're going to generate home index. And again, home is the text for the anchor tag. About is the text. It looks the same, but actually these are the text values. These are the methods. This, if you notice, it's the same controller. Home, home, home. It's the same controller we're using every single time. We're using the home, the index method of the home controller, the about method of the home controller, the contact method of the home controller, right? To give you an understanding of what's happening here. All right, and look, we come to this area here called render body. Render body, right? Again, we're gonna go in detail about this next week. But render body is the place where we get that partial file that for index.cshtml, and we smash it into here. We kind of inject it into this place. So that's where it comes into play, right? So our body gets injected in here, and then we have our scripts to render our bundles for jQuery, our bundles for Bootstrap, and do I render any sections for script? And it says required is false. Okay, if there is no render section. Render section, you can put it or not. I can actually take this out and it wouldn't do anything for me. All right, so this is our layout, and we're going to use this layout over and over again, of course. Whenever we create new views, I want to point to this layout because it's going to give us kind of a consistent look and feel, that kind of thing. We have a problem though, right? If I want to use font awesome, right? And again, I got to thank John for this one. This HTML action link stuff will not work. Why? It's only the anchor tag. Where's the I tag? This is going back to what we did with web forms again. If it's too bundled, it's like we have to decouple it a little bit. And there's another way of doing this without using. We're still going to use a helper that's still going to kind of form up with Microsoft's philosophy of don't code anything, don't hard code anything, right? To some degree. but we're going to use another kind of helper to help us do this one, as opposed to for these particular links here, because we want to use icons, font icons, right? Font awesome. Okay, so just wanted to give you an overview of that. Let's create our first controller and then take a short break. Okay, and then we'll come back. And after we come back, I'm going to let you guys do the rest of them. I want to try and get you guys. I want to take a look and see if you guys got the right idea, and then we'll come back for some finishing touches. All right, how do we do this? So I'm going to go back to my solution. First, let me close all this stuff, right? And I want to go back to my Solution Explorer, pin this up, right? And I want to add a new controller. Well, how would I do it? Well, I'm going to right-click on Controllers. This is new. Okay, I'm going to click on Add, and then I'm going to go Controller. Okay, you can do this or Scaffolded Item. I prefer Controller, right? When I click Controller, it brings up a list. The one I want, now mine might be different than yours, but the one I want is MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. This one. Okay. What this is going to do is it's going to help me scaffold out my controller and my views in one click, pretty much. Let's check this out. Let's go to Add. And now it's asking me for my model class. Now remember, in order for you to use the scaffold, I want to warn you of two things. One, you have to have a project that's been built with the models in place. Those are the two things. So it's got to be built, and it's got to have the models already pre-done in place and already built up before you come here. If you've just injected the models into your application by adding an ADO.NET data model for the first time, it'll fail. You have to. We've already built this up. We've already run the application, so we're good. But if you were doing it for the first time, if you get an error, it'll tell you have to build the application. Be aware that that might be an error that you're going to get. Here, we don't have that problem. We've already got our models. We've already built the project, so we're good. Our model class, we're going to use the student as the beginning. So we're going to go down and kind of use this drop-down list, go to student. And for our data context class, we've already have that. It's called Contoso model. So we got those two things. So this is the DB context. This is our model for the model we're going to use to build up our controller, right? Now, I'm going to use async controller actions. Why? Why am I going to use async controller actions? Is that a good thing? How about come on, you web guys and girls? Why is async a good thing? Asynchronous. Yeah, I mean, if I have a lot of transactions, right, I can add, my data models and my controllers can use asynchronous, connections as opposed to synchronous connections. Synchronous connections mean I got to wait for one to finish before I start the other one, right? That's okay for a small site, but for a larger site with a lot of transactions, and an example of that would be an e-commerce site, potentially, bad. So we use async. It's a bit more overhead for us when it comes to building our model, however, or our controller. Just be aware of that, but I'm going to put that into place. Next is this. Notice that there's generate views. We're going to do that. Reference script libraries. We're going to do that. Use a layout page. We're going to click on this little ellipses here and use our layout page we used before. Under shared, we're going to click on layout.cshtml. And press OK. So that's our layout page. Now notice that the controller name has already been done for us, and it says student's controller. Now here's the sad part. If you're a person who's using the school computer in front of you, right? And I apologize ahead of time, right? Because you won't have this beautiful little scaffolder. It'll look totally different. It'll ask you to put in the name of the controller. It'll ask you to do a bunch of other stuff in here, but this is what you need. It'll look exactly like this. You just have to do it manually, right? Here, there's less manual work. It guesses what the controller name is going to be, and all I need to do now is click Add. So it's going to go out, look at the model, and automatically create everything you need from a controller perspective and all of its views, right? It's going to take a little bit of time, but because remember what it's doing is also fetching the entity framework. Any other piece of the entity framework it needs, we already have it there, but any other pieces it's going to grab from the web, NuGet, and put it in place. Bam, we have our students controller. Okay, let's take a look. So here's what students looks like, right? So students, if I go to students, I'm going to go to my index. Here's what's happening here. Let's take a look, because we're talking about controllers today, right? I have a private variable that's been created called Contoso model DB. DB is the actual object. Contoso model is the type. Just like we did before. Remember last time when we did web forms, we We kind of created our context, but we have to do it every time. Every time we do some kind of method, it would be like using, you know, control cell model db is equal to new control cell model. We did that all the time, over and over again. Here we do it once, right? That's a good thing. That means we only make one connection, right, to the model. All right, here's the next one. In our index, notice that we have action results, but now because we're using async, it's a little different. The syntax is a little different, but really at the end of the day, it's just returning an action result, right? Whenever we use async, we have to use async and await, right? So async is an asynchronous method, and we're awaiting the student to come back with data, right? The database to come back. And whenever we connect to a database, it's, in my opinion, it's super important to use asynchronous kind of methods as opposed to synchronous. If there's any delay with the database whatsoever, you're going to get the guy or the user waiting, and it could even time out, right? This way, it's asynchronous. You're going to put, you know, post a request. Something else is going to happen on the web page. You can be waiting or whatever for a long time, but when it comes back, and it's not going to break your page. Okay, so that's what happens. So first we declare it. Now, here's what this does. My index returns DB, so that's the actual database, students, which is the field, and then we're changing it to list. We're returning a list of students. Okay, cool. Let's take a look at the related index.cshtml page. Here's my related index.cshtml page. Notice that it's named the same, index here. It's also named index here, but they're two different indexes. One is part of the home controller, and the other one is part of the students controller. Let's take a look at this one. Okay, more Razor syntax. At model. At model means we have to have an IEnumerable type model, right? This is the interface. We're looking at the student model that's inside the models folder. That's what it's saying, and that's what model is. So model, lowercase, is the model that's inside of our student, our models folder, the student. So student is the model that we're pointing to for this page. So not only does this page know about the controller, right, but it also knows what the model refers to. Okay. Okay. Here's another @ sign and some more Razor syntax. My view bag title is index. My layout. This is my custom my layout file, layout CSHTML, and then we get into the fun. Okay, we'll make a table, and the table itself is for each of our table headers. Here's our table header. We use a little bit of this HTML helper, and it says, so display for, okay, now what's this syntax here? What's this? Who knows what that is? Huh? What is it? A lambda expression. Thank you, Cindy. Lambda expression is a short form for an anonymous function. Okay, I want you to think of it this way. So imagine I have an anonymous function or anonymous call, right? Normally in JavaScript, it'd be like this. Function, open bracket and close bracket, right? And then curly braces, and then return something, right? Okay, whoa. And it's not just a return, I'm not just doing an anonymous function, it's an anonymous callback function, right? So instead of doing an anonymous callback function, I use a lambda expression. The lambda expression says this, pass in the model to the function. And then what I want to do is I want it to return the last name that belongs to the model, right? So I'm using the lambda expression to take the last name of the student. That's what the model is, the student model, right? Right, student model. And I'm taking it and I'm returning it right here inside of my header of my table. So I'm using this HTML helper, which is display name for, and I'm getting a lambda expression to return the name for this particular header. I'm doing it again and again. For the first mid name, for the enrollment date, it's all going right here. Okay? Then I do a for each. Remember, I use the @ syntax, and I use a for each loop, right? And what I'm doing is I'm saying for every item in the model, item would be the student, right? For every student in students, basically is what I'm saying, right? Go through and do one of these. I'm using the same display for syntax, and I'm using the lambda expression to say, hey, get the last name and pop it into this column. Get the first name and pop it into this, first mid name and pop it into this column. Get the enrollment date and pop it into this column, right? Okay, cool. And then I have a bunch of action links. I have an edit field, a details field, and a delete field. Cool. So that's what this is doing. This is the index page, and this is coming from here, from my index controller. All this code's been written for us right from the model. I haven't written a stitch right now. Let's run this thing and see what happens. So I'm going to go back to my index page and click play. It's going to build this thing out, and what you're going to notice immediately is a couple things, right? One is that I'm going right to the students page, right? So students index, this is the URL path that I'm going to use, right? And bam, I've got a list of students. Now that took us like 2 hours. We just did this in like 10 minutes. With my heavy explanation, take my heavy explanation out of there, 5 minutes, right? Even less, right? So this is what I want you to do for your thing, for your lab 4. I want you to do the rest. I want you to scaffold out your courses controller, your department's controller, your enrollment's controller, and the appropriate view should be scaffolded up for you. Okay, now here's some little bit extra, all right? One is I don't have any links for any of this stuff, right? So one of the challenges is I need to link to all this stuff here. That's number one. 2, what if, I'm just putting it out there, what if I want to change how this looks? How do I do that, right? We're going to come back to that. For now, what I want you to do, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and I'll let you guys start working on your lab, all right, together in class. So I want you to generate all those things. I want to deal with some of the problems you're going to have connecting to your database and doing all that kind of stuff. But I want you to generate all the views that you need for the project. So I want you to create 3 more controllers, okay? And then we'll come back and I'll take a look at fixing some of these problems that we have, especially when I want to add things like Font Awesome and different kind of classes for everything else we want to do. Okay, so we'll take a 15-minute break, 10 to 15-minute break. When we come back, we'll work on our lab for a bit of time, and then I'll come back and finish off the day with some neat little fixes we're going to use for the rest of this thing.